Welcome back to the main thread. Today we're talking about community building in and out of the office. Our guest, David Cunningham, runs a meetup in New York City called New York Tech and Beer, and it's exactly what it sounds like. A place for techies to hang out and get to know each other over a couple of brews. David is passionate about bringing people together, and I love how he turns that passion into action. As you're listening, I want you to think about the roles you play in your own community. Maybe you're the social planner, maybe you coach Little League, or maybe you're a dungeon master. Whatever it is, did anyone ask you to do that or explicitly give you that authority? Or did you just gravitate towards your interests and put yourself out there? Now, what about work? Are you defined by the title given to you by your company, or do you put yourself out there to take on broader roles that align with your strengths? I think you're going to love hearing from David, who has figured out how to do both. Let's get into it. Hey, welcome back to the main thread, everybody. I am Brian Ogilvy, along with my co-host,
Alex Geiser.
And we are joined today by our friend David Cunningham, who's a senior engineer and project lead at the New York Times. He's also a community organizer in the New York tech community. David, you want to give us a quick rundown of who you are and how you got to where you are today?
Yeah, sure. So I started out studying another kind of engineering, mechanical engineering, and picked up software after graduating college, started writing scripts on the job, and now I'm here.
How did you transition from that other type of engineering to the engineering you're doing now?
Yeah, so I got a degree in mechanical engineering, and then I got a job as a system engineer for an aerospace contractor. And we were doing like requirements analysis and stuff that I wasn't really super excited by as far as like a primary career path. And so in the area I was in the town I was in that company, all their work had to do with information technology. So it was like data science and analysts and system engineers and software engineers. So I didn't really have like an option to find a mechanical job within, that. And I was had to decide whether I was going to go to another job and look for something mechanical or really get into software, which was kind of my second love. That was something I always was interested in. And so at one point in a project, we needed some stuff automated, and it was just we were doing all this stuff manually with files and stuff. And so I started writing programs to automate it, and they let me just do that full time because none of the other system engineers wanted to figure out how to do it. So I started doing that full time, and then picked up stuff along the way, took modules online, and read a bunch of books and talked to software engineers whenever they would put up with me. And 8 years later, I'm full-time software engineer.
That's awesome. Yeah, we're still doing that. We're still talking to software engineers whenever they talk to us. So that's how we're still trying to build ourselves up as better engineers and better members of the community. The reason we wanted to have you on the show today, David, is because you were a instrumental force in getting us integrated into the tech community when we first joined a few years after you did. And I've always just been so impressed by your ability to build a giant network of people who become friends, become professional contacts, and through your work with New York Tech and Beer, and now you've got a new meetup that I'm sure you could talk about at some point later on in the podcast. But I'd just love to know how you got started in all of that, in building communities the way that you do, and what goes into sustaining them and all of that.
Cool. Yeah. I guess like going back a ways, I was always a person who kind of felt comfortable taking the lead on little things like socially and stuff. Maybe I was a bossy kid, I don't know, but I didn't mind being like the one to like kind of point the group in a direction if no one else wanted to. I also kind of was comfortable with bringing people together, for one thing or another. And kind of, I always liked kind of connecting people. And so in college, I was captain of an intramural team, and I was on some other clubs. And after college, I put together this trivia group that went on for a year, and in this trail running group that went on for a year. So different things. Also, I've had like a few fundamental moves since I graduated high school. So when I was in high school in Maryland, I went to school in Denver, where I didn't know anyone, and my parents moved to Asia when that happened. And then I transferred to school in Nashville, and then where I didn't know anyone. And then I graduated, went down to Huntsville, Alabama, this aerospace town, didn't know anyone there. And then finally New York. So, and like I had some summer internships where it was similar for at least the summer where it was in a random place and didn't know anyone. So, so I've had all these huge like uprootings sort of. And one big thing that I learned from that as far as meeting people and meeting new people, which is something some people will never really have to do if they stay in the same place or basically the same place for a long time, is that groups like meetups, everyone's there for a common purpose, and you know they have common interests depending on what the premise of it is, but they also, anyone who's at a group like that, generally speaking, could be doing that activity alone a lot of the times. You know, they could be playing piano or whatever, and people are there to either network and or make friends. Like everyone is there for that common purpose in most of these groups. And so I found that was the best way to really like find people who were open to making friends. And so about 4 years ago, I just on a whim looked up to see if there was like a beer drinks meetup for techies that met kind of frequently, or at least free, like just in general. I was like for a beer drinks meetup for techies, and I went on Meetup, and there was one, and it was in Brooklyn, and it met like once every like month and a half. And I was like, well, I'm never going to like really make friends that way. I'd been to other meetups where it's a one-off event or something, and like you really generally need a couple collisions with someone before I think you really start like clicking if there's that potential. And
you got to get your reps in.
Yeah, you really do. You know, like if you're lucky sometimes, but like it's after the first hangout. But I think like like relationships, most friendships aren't love at first sight. They're love after a couple dates.
Yeah, for sure.
And so I decided just on a whim that afternoon in July 2019 to start a meetup that was for that purpose, and I called it New York Tech and Beer because I like the sound of that. And started doing events. I created it on Meetup, created a little website for it. And our first event was like a week and a half after I created the thing on Meetup. We did events every week for the first 9 months. And then after the lockdown, we did virtual and park, and then came back to the bars later. And, we're about 125, 130 events in now, 4.5 years later. So yeah, it's been a lot of fun.
That sounds exactly like what we learned. Brian and I both went to a talk last night, and the themes that they touched on, the talk was about being a staff engineer and how to reach the level, very close to the theme of this podcast. And everything that they mentioned was making multiple points of contact with people, building relationships, being a leader. All of that sounds like it translates directly from your experience building up New York Tech and Beer. So I was curious if you could talk about how New York Tech and Beer has helped you professionally, or just any advice you have for people like me and Brian trying to build a community here, sort of, with our podcast.
Who definitely don't have the energy
we don't have the chops
to build our own meetup community. We can barely show up.
For a podcast, it's a little bit more asynchronous, a little lower weight.
A little lower key. Yeah. So I'm a software engineer by day. So I guess like it has helped me professionally. So like if I won a coding competition, or I was like on the side built like a startup or something, that would have a certain weight as far as getting like another software engineer job, or getting a, better software engineer job or whatever. This is something that's a little more tangentially related, though I think we can get into why, it is, I think, important in a lot of ways to like a software career. But, I think it's helped me in that I think people like people who are plugged into the community at large. And, I think there's, it shows there's things that, running something like this can indicate about, your willingness to plug in and your willingness to take initiative on things that I think people like. And there's, a leadership element. So I think it's helped. Yeah, I've had a lot of interviews where people have brought up how they thought it was like a neat thing to do. So, yeah.
So I think there's the one aspect of, has this community directly influenced your career in terms of people knowing about it or anything like that? But then there's also the aspect of like skill transfer. Has what it takes to manage this community, have you learned anything doing that? And have you used those types of skills for when, say, you need to build enthusiasm for a project? Because sometimes that's one of the biggest roadblocks in the way of a highly complex project getting across the finish line, is that there's just not enough enthusiasm around it, or people knowing what it is or wanting to be involved in it and help out.
Or even just something as simple as building relationships with your colleagues.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think I've definitely learned a lot about taking initiative, leadership. So I organize Tech and Beer. We've done about 130 events. I've been the host for most of them. I'm lucky enough to have friends that have helped host some as well. But I've been the host for definitely the vast majority of them. And I think that like the act of waiting at a venue for 10, 20, 50, 100 people to show up that night, and you being the first face they see, and you talking with them, engaging with them, strangers, people, it's kind of like the 1,000 hours a little bit, I think.
Or Malcolm Gladwell's like 10,000 hours. Is that what you mean?
Yeah. Sorry. 10,000.
Yeah.
Not the way I do it. No. We
could get that down to 1,000.
Yeah, we can get it down to that's the American approach. Let's just stick to 1,000. But no, yeah. So, I think I've gotten those kind of 10,000 hours in some ways, where like, I think I was always a pretty outgoing guy, but I'm pretty fearless when it comes to new people, when it comes to talking, to a group, when it comes to talking to people. And in general, kind of sticking my neck out when I think like there's something worth doing or saying. And I think the act of running this and hosting is one thing, like skill that's definitely served me. And I think as a result, also just like the confidence I've gained with regards to organizing things, organizing people, organizing events has helped me in helping my teams at times with organizing things for them, some social, some more professionally oriented, and we could get into that. But I think that's one thing. There's also just a whole constellation of cool skills that comes with organizing these if you try to like master all the elements. It's been interesting.
I'm always amazed when we talk that you're playing with some new technology and like stuff that I just never even heard of. You're like, oh, did you know that I found this place where you can customize a QR code that'll allow people to just register for your mailing list with one, snap of the camera, that kind of stuff. But it also looks cool. It looks like our own custom logo, that kind of stuff. It just like, you seem so curious, and you're always just trying to find the next way to keep things interesting for people and market it and make sure you can include more people in the community. I think that's so awesome.
Yeah, it's a labor of love. I enjoy it.
One thing that came up recently is how difficult it is to build these skills. Generally, lots of times people give the advice of, just get better at communication. But this seems like a good way for you to build those skills in real life, in a real practical way, and skills that can be very difficult to learn.
Yeah, I think there are different kinds of communication, so there's different contexts. You have different ways you discuss things, or the ways you hash things out, so like with Tech and Beer events, a lot of the communication is on the more casual end, but also like I reach out to bars and I discuss with them, and maybe a little negotiation to get them to help us with some things, in return for us bringing them business. So, there's some communications like that I don't know that I would get much of in my day-to-day job, like customer relationship type things. And then with like the AI event, those are tech talks. So that's like another type where I'm finding speakers and working with them and collaborating with them, and figuring out if what their proposed talks work, and how to massage it and all that stuff. I think in all those regards, I mean, really socializing and leadership, I really think are a practice thing. And I think you aren't always given those opportunities to practice, in your day-to-day life. Like if you're not going out a lot for one reason or another, and then, you might only socialize with a very limited set of people that you already know well. As far as leadership, if you're not like, an engineering manager or something, you might not be at least explicitly granted opportunities to lead and to get practice in that. So yeah, I think this has been a really cool way for me to get a lot of practice in all those things. And that's been really neat. And, I think some of that comes down to finding ways that you can do things like that. And I think the big thing is that people don't always ask you to do them, or people don't always come to you and tell you that they want you to do a thing. And especially when it comes to leadership, I think very rarely do people explicitly ask someone else to like lead the way. But people, in my experience, are often very happy to be led if you have a good purpose. If you have something compelling that you think, would be worth doing, you can find people who, are willing to work with you on that. So yeah, I think like, this is an example where, no one told me to make the meetup, but doing that has granted me a lot of, I guess, a lot of opportunity to practice a lot of things that if I just stuck with, my work duties, I don't know that I would have gotten a lot of experience in the last 4 years.
Can you talk a little bit about when you say practice? Like, I assume that it's not necessarily a skill that has 100% success rate right away, right? Correct me if I'm wrong, but I'm assuming that the first time you held your meetup, you didn't have 40 people show up or 50 people show up, right? You had to start with something and take that leap of showing up at a bar and seeing like, well, is anybody going to come? And then iterate on your process. Like, how do you make those adjustments? How do you actually practice, as you said? How do you actually practice this to be sure you're actually building a community that people want to be a part of?
Oh man, I could probably write at least a novelette or a novella on that. There's a lot that goes into it. I think I guess at least trying to summarize. I think initially there's finding people, and so that's like finding the right platforms where the people you want are, right. And this is kind of some of this is kind of marketing 101, but like just finding where your demographic is and putting the word out there. So like Meetup is a good place for organizing things because that's the most common one people generally go to, but there are other ones. So then 2 is quality of experience for like event management. When they get there, you want them to feel good about being there and feel good about it after the fact. 3 is retention of the people who do come to events. So like, not everyone, some people, maybe they weren't super into it or they were, but they don't want to, they want to just don't want to be bothered. But like for everyone who's game, you want to try to keep a line open with them after the events. And that can be like get their email. And so you can send them a newsletter. That can be add them to like a WhatsApp chat or some chat group, giving them the Instagram and they follow your Instagram and then you put stuff out on the Instagram, on the Instagram story. So we do all 3 of those, among other things. For the people that have demonstrated that they're interested enough to come to an event, which is a pretty high bar, like asking anyone to go anywhere is a lot to ask, really. And it's an honor
so
that people
hard
come out.
To get anybody out of their apartment is so hard.
Yeah. And, that's one thing I love about organizing these is like every time I host an event and like 40, 50 people come, it's like, wow, you all just came for this, like that, and it definitely drives me. But, of those people that, actually made a point to come out, trying to like keep the line open, that's a very special thing. Whether you have a product, a service, an event, you're running events, keeping that line open in one way or another. I would say those are like the 3 big ones. It's like finding the people where they are, giving, delivering on what you're promising them, and then keeping them in the loop afterwards. Yeah, I'd say that's like the high level.
All of those seem like valuable skills for any aspiring staff engineer to have, don't they?
It's amazing the corollaries.
I think that I think that's a pretty good argument for how community organizing outside of work is a good, at least a good way to build the skills that you need as an engineer, as you move up. I was kind of curious if you've had any experiences with building community at your workplace, or if that's something that's been at all helpful for you. You mentioned to me one time that the workplace is another community, and that kind of blew my mind because, you think of your personal life and your work life as separate things for good reason. But then the idea of building a community in your work, the same way you would build it outside of work, is interesting. You spend a lot of time at work. Makes sense.
Yeah, I think, when we think about community outside of work, right, you think of like your church or your kickball club or whatever, right? Like community, I think the way we think about it generally is that it's this fluid thing and we all are like playing our part, and anyone can be anything in a community in a way, right? Like you can try to be the mayor. Who you are in the town you live in is something that is seen as flexible, and it's something that you could theoretically change at any time. Your perception, your role. I think in your job, in companies, we're often, I think, much less disposed to think about ourselves that way, in that flexible way, right? So you get hired, you're given like a title, right? Like in your town, you're not like David the this or whatever, you're just David. But in a company, you're given a title and you're given, a contract that kind of lays out all the things that are expected and not expected of you. And, that's all well and good, but like you can also be more or less or different than that, in your company. Like your company is also a community, and that like, aside from what is expected of you contractually, you can define what you are in other ways. And, that includes leading. If you're a mid-level software engineer, even senior, junior, whatever, you're often not asked or given explicit opportunities to lead. And, it may not be in your control whether you are like, the head of some project that they've, laid out or something. But you can lead in different ways. A few examples. One are like, team events. It may seem trivial, but like if you're the person who organizes like a happy hour for your team, even at the least, one that I think that shows that you're plugged in to your team as a community rather than just as like this capitalist entity or whatever, it shows that you're plugged in. And I really think that's looked upon positively by both your teammates and, management. You're trying to, be the change you want to see in the world, or at least in your team. It can garner a lot of goodwill in different directions. And then there are things like you can do like organize things that are more involved. So you can like that are more, I guess I should say like work related. Like you can organize a hackathon or like a doc rewrite day. Or on the even more technical side, you can look around and see, oh, this would be a cool project. And maybe they don't have time, to invest you or other people in it. Maybe they do, but you could be the one to bring that up and like, write up a plan on your own and say, this would be a cool, I don't know, microservice to create. I wrote up a tech plan. No one asked me to be this person, but I'm just going to like put my foot out there and like, we'll see how people feel about it. And I think in that way, just like, your company is a community in that respect, and in that like we can be who we want to be in our company in more ways than our, what's written on our contracts. And, not everyone wants to do that necessarily. Not everyone wants to, to do a whole extra project or make a whole extra plan, but there's a lot more benefits, there's, and you're sticking your neck out a little in whether they'll buy into whatever thing you're trying to do. But, on different levels, from a happy hour to like, proposing a whole new like team project, you can try to be that change and, and see, where it gets you. And the cool thing is that when people do buy into it, then you're the nexus of that thing, and it can be something casual or it could be something more serious. But just like in your, your community outside of work, if you make a point of leading something, being the nexus of that thing is a very special result of that that is hard to achieve just by waiting for someone to ask you to do something.
Yeah, my manager and I were having a conversation today, and he was encouraging me to be willing to take more risks in the way that you're talking about right now, like stick my neck out there, even though no one asked me to provide leadership or guidance in a certain field. Like it's on me to sort of stick my neck out and say, I think there is a great way we could do this, or here's a suggestion, even though I have that nervousness in the back of my mind, like, hey man, nobody asked you. But It's
Yeah.
like, if you want to provide that kind of value to the world, you have to sometimes just go and start providing it. And then sometimes people say, no, thanks, we don't need that right now. And then you respectfully say, okay, cool, no problem. But if you don't go try, then you're depriving everyone of what you might have to offer, which they might be needing.
And I've learned and the more senior I've gotten, the more I've learned that all of that becomes dramatically easier and dramatically less risky the more people you have relationships with, which is another way that building this community can really help you, getting to know lots of different people. And then you're a known quantity. So then when you say this is a thing that needs to be done, they know you. You're not some random person who's suggesting it. They at least know you, at least on a personal level, which is how a lot of these things, that's the difference maker a lot of the time, whether we like it or not. It's like being personable. I like it because I like people, but that's an important thing, is being personable.
Yeah. And I think another thing is like negotiation, that there's some of that. And what I do is like an organizer with like venues and other relationships. And, I think that's another thing that, as an engineer, you don't necessarily get a lot of experience with, but that's like that's, I think, an undercurrent in some of these things, in terms of like, if you're trying to lead something, understanding that some of this stuff is a negotiation. Sometimes they'll be like, oh, we don't need that, instead of just saying, okay, maybe being like, but do you need half of that? Or do you need this part of that or something? And thinking in terms of these decisions between two parties, whether it's you and your boss or what have you, are not like binary. They don't have to be binary. It doesn't have to be either they choose or you choose. It can be like something in the middle. And, that's just, I guess, another example of like where getting practice in that, whether you're doing it, through taking initiatives at work and learning how to like navigate that, or, making a community outside of work, or both, that's definitely a valuable skill.
That's awesome. We're getting close to time, but I'd love to hear just a little bit about if your efforts here in the communities you've built outside of work have provided the impact that you hoped it would on your personal life and on the community at large.
Yeah, I think people definitely ask me a lot about why I started Tech and Beer. I host events every week or two. And so I meet all these new people every event, and a lot of them ask me that. And it's hard to answer. I think like, some of it comes down to like, it seemed like a cool thing to do. And I think I've always felt like being the person to make something like that happen and connect people and be that nexus has always been a really exciting thing for me. And I think it's, it's kind of a sacred thing to me, like being the person that creates a marketplace for relationships and for people to connect and for people to find friendships, find, love, find a job. Being the person that facilitates that, to me, is like a very special thing. I think that we are, in some really fundamental ways, we're very communal creatures. So I think that we need community, we thrive with community, and we struggle without it. There's studies that show that loneliness is as bad a health problem as some major things, as far as like causing long-term illness. So, doing that has always been something really satisfying for me. I think as far as what I've gotten out of it, Tech and Beer's gotten big enough now where I'm really kind of honored that I'll go to some party and I'll meet a techie from New York and they'll have heard of Tech and Beer, and they've never come to it, but they're like, oh yeah, I've seen that. That's really cool. I think like seeing that people over the years, we've had regulars that have come to the event for years, and maybe not every single event, but they've come for years, or some came for a year and then they come back 2 years later. Seeing that people get that satisfaction, enjoyment out of it, I think is big. And then I think like we talked about, just all the skills that came with that and all the practice that gave me with things that really are relevant to other facets of life and my professional life. It's been a really fulfilling thing for me. That's awesome.
All right, I think that's the one. That's the single tier closing monologue moment we were looking for. It's perfect. So I'm gonna move us to picks and plugs. I think it's time. So David, we'll start with you. Just give you a chance to make any plugs you want. I know you've got some meetups. Anything else you want to share with our listeners? The floor is yours.
Awesome. Yeah. So there's the meetups. There's New York Tech and Beer, like we discussed. And we do happy hour socials about every 2 weeks. They're a lot of fun. And New York AI User Group, which are AI Tech Talks. We have 2 speakers come once a month. We reserve a whole space and they come and give a tech talk, and then there's social time after. That's a lot of fun. Both of those you can find on nyctnb.com or meetup.com/NYCTNB or meetup.com/NYCAIU. Yeah, those are the plugs. And you said we want to do a pick.
Yeah, something you think our listeners would benefit from. Anything. Doesn't have to be tech related.
Yeah, well, so this was one thing, since I guess we're talking about community building in this episode a little more than we're talking about algorithms or, so the more tech heavy stuff. One thing that was really helpful for me that I read in the first 2 or 3 months of starting Tech and Beer was called the one-page marketing plan. It's kind of like the crash course for a lot of key marketing concepts, especially for a small organization, and promoting something that's small where you don't work for a giant corporation with a massive budget or any budget, and that was really relevant to me figuring out how to be more methodical in promoting the meetup and how to connect with people, figure out, what they were getting out of it, what they wanted from it, and whether we were meeting that, and, keeping in touch with them. So it was just, it has a cheesy name, but the one-page marketing plan was super interesting, informative for me, and being an organizer.
Awesome. Alex, what's up?
I also want to plug New York Tech and Beer and the AI tech talks, the New York AI user group tech talks, because Brian and I are both alums of that. That's how we met. David was New York Tech and Beer, actually. So we've been going to that for a long time. And so if you're listening to this and you haven't been to either of those, you should definitely go. So I know it's maybe a little bit obvious, but that's my plug as well as David's plug. And then I just have a bunch of picks other than that. First is, because I was recently reminded of it, because it's an amazing book, and I try to leaf through it as much as possible, is Designing Data-Intensive Applications. That's basically your one-stop shop, giant, walnut cracker textbook for anything related to big cloud engineering topics. It's got 100 different little things in there that are really useful. Something as basic as from kinesis streams all the way to just sharding rules. It's awesome. And it got plugged recently. So now I'm stealing that other person's plug. And then I have 2 YouTube videos. I've been rewatching. I love Scott Walaschin. He's, at least I think that's how you say his name. He's got a number of functional programming videos. They're really cool. And I rewatch them every couple of years, and every single time I understand about 6% more. So I'm at about understanding about 22% of these 2 videos. But first one is 13 Ways of Looking at a Turtle. That's basically writing a little a program to do drawing as if it was on the head of a turtle, moving it around. It's a classic problem. I'm not doing it justice, but then there's 13 different design patterns that you can use to build that turtle. And then functional design patterns, which is just going through a number of common functional design patterns, but it's just generally a good intro to how to write functional code and the general principles for writing functional code. And he's also just a very fun speaker. So I'm plugging both of his videos. Those are my 2 picks: Scott Walaschin's 13 Ways of Looking at a Turtle and Functional Design Patterns.
Nice. I love that you brought up designing data-intensive applications. We're actually going through it in my book club at work right now, and it's really great. I actually have not read it before. This is my first time, so it's good stuff. I'm also going to pick a talk. Coincidence there. This is an oldie but a goodie. This is a talk that Rich Hickey, who's the creator of Clojure, gave at Strange Loop back in 2011. The talk's name is Simple Made Easy. And this talk, he basically outlines the difference between easy, which means at hand, nearby, easy to grasp, versus simple, which literally means not complex. And as engineers, he ties this into the concept of software engineering. We often reach for the easy thing, the way that solves our problem very quickly. And that can, down the road, if you make too many of those decisions, lead to tremendously complex and not simple software. Whereas if instead you reach for what's simple, even though it might not be easy in the time, if you consistently make those simple decisions, the decisions that remove complexity, build simplicity, over time, you will find that what you're building is easiness. So it's a strange paradox between if you focus on simplicity it's easy to use it later. It's easy to build it. It's easy to maintain it. It's easy to be the right solution. Whereas if you focus on easiness, you end up with something that is complex and very difficult to maintain and work with. Anyway, it's great. It's about an hour long, but it's worth a listen. Really a good one if you haven't listened to it before. That brings us to the end of Picks and Plugs. David, we want to say thanks so much for being here. This is great. And thanks for running your meetup. I mean, this has been a great community building opportunity for us to just be a part of the community that you've built. And it's been great for the last few years that we've been involved. And just really want to thank you for your time on the podcast today.
Yeah, thanks for having me on. This was a blast.
All right. Well, listeners, that's it for today. We'll catch you next time. Thanks for listening to The Main Thread. As always, the views expressed by the hosts and guests of The Main Thread are our own and do not reflect those of our respective places of employment. Are you enjoying the podcast? Do you have a topic you'd like to hear discussed in a future episode? Well, please reach out to us with any suggestions or feedback. We are at The Main Thread on all major social media platforms, including Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, and of course, Threads. If you prefer, you can send us an email at mainthreadpodcast@gmail.com. For links to resources mentioned in today's episode or to download a transcript of the podcast, please refer to our show notes. That's all for today's episode. Thanks again for listening, and we'll catch you next time on The Main Thread.